right, welcome again. We are looking forward to some real world stories. So take it away from here.
Thank you. So just to quickly introduce myself, my name is actually Ian Mingers-Runciman, but I go by the name of Ming because the bit that looks like Menzies it's an old Scots name, and it's actually pronounced Mingus. And as part of my education of the English and the Sassenachs, I've shortened that down as Ming to try and get them to realize that the correct pronunciation of my name. But just a little bit there. So about me, I've been a Linux and Unix consultant for over 30 years now. Embedded Linux consultant and trainer for about 15 years. And I basically spend my days at the moment building applications and various systems for my clients using the Yocto project. Website, siliconbladeconsultants.com. It had to be the long one because siliconblade.com was taken by some Windows squeegee, so I had to go and do a really long one, but there we go. So the typical things that I'm doing as part of my day. So I'm looking after multiple boards, multiple configurations, trying to look at the board bring up and supporting kernel configurations for these systems. I'm then trying to support multiple developers who may not know Linux very well, and highly likely they don't know anything about the Yocto project. So as the main administrator, I'm there to try and make their life easier so that they can be focusing on their development and not get bogged down within the details and all the things like that of the actual project. So I need to be able to maintain and update the system, and then potentially being able to update devices in the field. So this is kind of where I'm coming from in terms of what my particular perspective on how I make my life a little bit easier for me. So looking at a typical Yocto project maintainer and developer, we have to wear multiple hats. So we need to be a system administrator because we're the ones that are going to be putting together the entire system. Then we need to be a network administrator because it's highly likely that we're going to be looking at how do we get our box configured up, connected to whatever networks we've got. We need to be a performance specialist because we can guarantee that whatever we're doing, the user's going to come back and say, no, I need it to run faster. I need it to run better. So we need to have all of those kind of skills. We're a board bring-up specialist because the whole point of what we're doing is someone throws a lump of electronics on our desk and say, get that working. So we need to have those kind of skills. And then we need to be a kernel specialist in terms of being able to know all of the DTB, the device drivers, whatever we're needing to do to actually get our system up and running. So this is one of the reasons that I personally enjoy working within a Yocto project, is because there's so much variation on the type of things that we can be doing, and it's never going to be boring. So in terms of creating your project, this may be heresy, but I will always say that your first project, if you're coming into this field, should not be a Yocto project. I would always highly recommend looking at creating a system from scratch. Learn how to put a system together by hand the hard way, because then when you move to using a Yocto project, then you understand what is actually happening behind the scenes. So it just makes things easier to then grasp and move forward. So I would always recommend have a look at the linuxfromscratch.org and run through and build your own system from scratch. But when you come to building your own Yocto project itself, some of the main guidelines that I will be looking at is I like to try and keep a clean project layout. This is going to make it easier to update, easier to maintain, and also easier to share. And we'll be looking at how I would share my project amongst other users. Big thing for me is not having layers in the top level directory. It gets very messy very quickly. So I try and set up a particular type of structure that simplifies, in my head at least, how I can be presenting and keeping a track of what goes where. And my biggest thing is making sure that I separate out the layers that I've downloaded from whatever repository that aren't in my control from the layers that I'm creating myself. And that makes it a lot easier to maintain and easier just to keep a track of what is going on in my head, at least. So a typical project layout for me is I will have my actual project. I'll then have the build, which has got my conf, my temp, and all the standard things. So the stuff that is created for you when you start your actual BitBake project. I will then create a layers directory. And under the layers directory, I will create two more directories. I will have a project directory, which is where my stuff lives, and I will have a third-party directory. And under the third party is where I'm going to keep any layers that I have downloaded from the internet. And therefore, I know that I don't touch those, because you shouldn't be modifying anything that is coming in that you don't have complete control of. Because the minute you then do an update, so when you're moving from Kirkstone up to Scarf Gap or whatever, it's going to overwrite any of the changes that you made unless you have upstreamed them. So it is far easier to go, right, let's separate them out into the two directories, and knowing that if I've got something that is under that third party, I'm going to be needing to do a BB append, not actually editing the actual BitBake file itself. And then for the actual layers that I have got, my suggested minimum of the way I do things. So I'll split them into that three layers at least of a BSP layer. And in there is where I'm going to be putting anything to do with the board bring up. So my machine definitions are going to live there. And then all of my kernel configurations and my U-boot things. So basically anything that is required to get the kernel up and running, I'm going to be putting into my BSP. I will then create a my distro thing. So this is, for me, anything to do with standard Linux user space. So these are the things that are standard tools that you would expect to find on a Linux system. In there, I'm going to put my distro configuration, because you need to remember that the Pokey distribution is a reference. It isn't meant for production. You're meant to start with the Pokey as your reference, and then start customizing it for the things that you're wanting. So because it's part of creating the user space, for me, I'm going to put that into my distro layer. And then anything else that is about adding or modifying standard stuff, so adding in my users, my configurations, my systemd changes, my network configuration, anything else like that goes into my distro layer. So basically, my distro layer is going to be a whole raft of BB appends, because it's all about appending stuff from elsewhere. And then lastly, I will have a my software, or whatever you want to call this, and this will be anything that you have created in-house. So all the things that you're creating as part of your project, because you've typically got some kind of application, because that's the whole reason you're creating the project. But if you put the things that you've written into a separate layer, it's then, for me, again, a lot easier of thinking, right, I'm going to be needing to modify what's happening on my DNS. Right, so I need to go and have a look at my things. My recipe is going to be in the distro layer. I need to be modifying on my particular application. It's going to be in the my software layer. So it's just helping me remember where things are so that I can quickly go and find them without having to go and search through hundreds of recipes to try and find things. So that's what I would have as my minimum. But I would then be looking at the whole concept of having layers is to allow for flexibility. So if I've got something that I'm going to be sharing across multiple projects, I will then put that into a separate layer. And then I can be able to include that layer across multiple projects for whatever I'm wanting to do. Now, one of the other things for me personally is I much prefer having lots of little layers over one large layer. Because if you've got a large layer with loads of recipes, when you're starting up your bitbake, it's going to have to parse all of the bitbake files that it finds. So if you've got a whole region of irrelevant bitbake files that you don't actually need, you're wasting startup time. And given that I'm probably going to be, doing multiple builds every day, that all adds up into a bit of wasted time. So for me, I definitely like to be able to have multiple layers. But even though if you're going to have multiple layers, you don't have to split them out into multiple repositories. You can have a single repository and then just having the multiple layers within that repository. And then your users would be able to choose which layers they're going to be wanting to include in their bitbake configuration files. So that's for me about giving the good flexibility. And a good example of if you're wanting to see how a single repository can hold multiple layers, things like the meta open embedded is a great example of lots of layers within that repository, and you only need to include the bits that you're actually interested in. So then working with the project itself. So based on the concept of the 3 virtues of a great programmer, which are basically laziness, impatience, and hubris. So on the concept of the laziness, I am far too lazy to go and type that full path to the OEN build init build env. Because having now created my directory structure, it's too many characters to type on the command line. So I create a little startup script that lives in my top level directory. And within there, I'm just going to be having a bash and with the ---- init file. And that is saying that when I'm going to run this script, it is actually going to start up a shell with all of these things initialized in it. So this enables me to create a new shell that has then got all of the open embedded environments set up correctly. Another little thing is because I have multiple projects on the go at the same time, I will also be looking at moving my shared directory, so my download directory and my my SS state cache outside of the project itself so that it can be shared across all of the projects that I'm working on at that particular time. So as part of my startup script, because again, I'm going to be potentially sharing this with other people, I'm making sure that it is going to be existing for anybody who's going to be running this particular script. Another thing you'll be noticing is I'm trying to make use of everything with a relative path, because when I come to the sharing, which I'll be looking at, I want to make sure that I don't have anything hard-coded within the paths of my system. So because I'm going to be adding the build directory to my git ignore, because there's absolutely no point including the build directory within the actual repo itself, then what I will be doing is it makes sure that the local.conf and the bblayers.conf, they're not going to be saved within the repository. But given that they shouldn't be changing very often in terms of their core content, then what we can be doing is I will save these as a template. And then also by saving it as a template makes it easier in terms of sharing the project. So when you're working with a team, because for me, I quite often am going to be working with remote developers. Most of my clients are going to be little startups where everybody is going to be a work from home or completely remote. But all of the developers, they're always going to want to have their own local copy of the project that they're going to be wanting to fiddle with, because they're wanting to build and put things onto their own hardware that's sitting on their desk. However, I also know that nobody reads the setup instructions. So within the README of all my projects, I will describe how you set it up, all the things that you need to be doing. So I've got two main options. I can either refuse to talk to them until they actually read the setup instructions, or I design around them. So the way I design around them is by making sure, as I said previously, about putting everything into relative directory structures. I keep my shared directory outside of the project, and I will put that under home Yocto share, and then I can be putting the download directory and the SSState directory in there. Seeing the comment about providing container images, then I do actually provide container images on an SDK, as that is a great way of being able to share the SDK amongst the developers that are only interested in developing. But I don't have time to go into how I set up my developers. For the local.conf, though, one of the other things is that I also think that this is a good place to be able to keep secrets, because there are various things whereby, for example, one of the things I'm working on at the moment I have to have an API key within the project itself. So knowing that I don't want to have that key saved in the repository, so I don't want to commit that key at all, then what I can do is within my local.conf, I can have whatever my key is, ABC123, etc. And then in the source file of whatever it is that needs the key, I'm just going to put a placeholder of whatever we're wanting to do. It's going to be something unique that I could then do a substitution. And then in the recipe, in my do install, once I've installed that configuration file, I can then just do a quick substitution for that key on whatever my secret key variable is. So because I am making sure that the key isn't going to be saved in the repository, it's only in the local conf, at that point I can shout at the developer if they're saying, but my build doesn't work, and I'm going, did you copy the secret key into your local.conf? In that case, go and try again. For my bblayers.conf, so for that, what I personally will do is I'm always trying to keep my paths relative. So allowing it to be shared. By making my paths relative, it would then work as a template so that it can then be picked up and used by any of the other people working on the project. It therefore allows also the project to be moved to a different location or to a different machine. So an example of some of the reasons of why I find this useful. At the moment, I've got 2 copies of a project I'm working on. So I've got the main project, and I'm also fiddling around with an experimental version that I'm not wanting to have for my actual production version. So I've just taken a copy of the project, moved it sideways, and I'm not having to worry about updating all of my paths for where everything is. So what I will do is I will create a Yocto root, and then within my BB layers, I will just have that as a variable so that will always come to a relative path for what is going on for where my actual layers are. So having created my configuration files, then what we can do is we can create a template directory within our project. Copy your configuration files into it. So copy the local.conf, the bblayers.conf, removing any secrets if you have gone down that way. And then what you can do is you can set up a template conf environment variable in your startup script. And then when, for the first time it starts up, if the local.conf and the bblayers.conf don't exist, then it will bring in the actual configuration files from your template configuration path. So another thing that I have to do quite often is I'm maintaining a production and a development images. So for my production system, I'm going to be shipping my production system with a read-only root file system because I'm wanting to have that from a security perspective. I don't want my root file system to be changed. Also, because I use Mender as my OTA for Delta updates in the field, that requires a read-only root file system. However, the disadvantage of a read-only root file system is that it's not so good for fiddling with as part of development. So I'm needing to have two separate images. I need a production image and I need a development image. So within my development image, I need to have all the things that are in production, but then I want to be able to have it to be read-write so that I can fiddle with it, so that I can install packages to find out what other packages I want for the next iteration of my release, etc. So it has to be read-write. And then I want some extra tools for debugging, for performance monitoring, for testing. I want the package manager, all of the other things that I'm wanting there as part of my development enhancements. So what I will do is within my development image, I will require my production image. So that is going to bring in an exact copy of all of the packages that are going to be part of my production system. And then the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to knock out the read-only rootfs. So I'll do an image features remove the read-only rootfs. And after that, I can then add in the extra tools that I'm wanting. So I can add in an editor. I can add in performance tools. I can add in the package manager. So I've now got my development image being a superset of all of the things that I've got for production with the tools that I'm wanting to fiddle around with from a development perspective. Any questions? I'm seeing that there were some questions coming through. So in terms of any way to disable a certain lines in a layer that you don't control without creating a local copy. Typically create my own layer with a BB append, but in some cases there's the middle of their recipe I'd like to modify. For me, I do still do things with a BB append, even if it's modifying something in the middle of it, because remembering that the BB append is going to overwrite the things. So if you've got some function that is in the middle of some recipe and you're wanting to modify that function, if you're modifying that within the BB append, then that should be good enough to do that. And is there a way to insert or delete code into the middle of a task rather than appending or prepending? I'm not aware of any way of being able to insert something into the middle. You either need to append it, prepend it, or completely overwrite it. Comment on the template.conf, doing the save build conf does it. But as I say, as you mentioned there, that it doesn't remove any secrets. So if you have got any secrets within your local.conf, then that wouldn't actually help. Various people saying using CAS. CAS is something I must admit I haven't looked at. It's something that when I get some of this magical free time, which doesn't actually ever occur, it's on my list of things to investigate. But great to see if there are other options as well and other techniques. It's always good to see some other things. And yes, my sword. So yes, a longsword fencer from the UK and currently France. Best strategy in maintaining your download and the SSD cache. in terms of for maintaining it, is that more about, because I just keep it to the side, it just updates or looks after itself. I will occasionally back up my downloads directory, especially if I'm wanting to protect my sources of, if I'm not sure that a particular file is going to still be around. At least if I've got a backup within my downloads directory backup, I can always recreate a particular image from whatever sources I originally had at the time of build. In terms of taking advantage of the repo, I don't, mainly because I'm much more in terms of Git submodules. I had a look at repo and just struggled to get my head around it, and went, I'll have a look at that when I have more time again. And it's back to that magic. What is the concept of spare time?
Right. One more question.
One more question, looking at ZFS or BTRFS, then yes, for having that on your host build system, and then being able to just snapshot is a good thing for that. So more questions, I will carry on answering them in the chat. So thank you all for at least staying awake for that little bit of presentation. There's my email, there's my website. Please do get in touch.